Karen's perfectly pedicured toes tapped impatiently as she waited in the school principal's office. The fluorescent lights overhead cast an unflattering glow on her face, but she didn't care. All that mattered was giving that insufferable man a piece of her mind. "Mrs. Anderson, the principal will see you now," the secretary said hesitantly, eyeing Karen's rigid posture and clenched fists. With a dramatic sigh, Karen swept into the office, her designer handbag dangling from her elbow. Principal Hawkins looked up from his desk, his brow furrowed with concern. "What seems to be the problem, Mrs. Anderson?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. Karen slammed her palms on the desk, leaning in until their faces were mere inches apart. "The problem is that you had the audacity to yell at my son in front of the entire class." She spat. "How dare you embarrass him like that?" Principal Hawkins blinked, taken aback by the sheer intensity of Karen's outburst. "I understand you're upset, but—" "Upset?" Karen interrupted, her voice rising in pitch. "I'm furious. My son is as straight a student and the star of the soccer team. He doesn't deserve to be treated like some kind of delinquent." The principal held up a hand, silencing her. "If you let me explain, Mrs. Anderson, I think you'll understand why I had to reprimand your son." Karen crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing to slits. "This better be good." Principal Hawkins took a deep breath. "Earlier today, your son was caught cheating on a test. When I confronted him about it, he became belligerent and refused to take responsibility for his actions. That's why I had to raise my voice, to get him to listen and understand the severity of what he'd done." Karen stared at him, her mouth agape. "Cheating," she scoffed. "There's no way my son would ever do something like that. He's an honest, hard-working boy. You must be mistaken." The principal shook his head. "I'm afraid there's no mistake, Mrs. Anderson. I have the test papers and witness statements to prove it." Karen's face flushed with outrage. "Well, then your witnesses must be lying. My son would never cheat, and I won't stand for you accusing him of such a thing." Principal Hawkins sighed heavily. "I understand you're upset, but the evidence is clear. Your son will be suspended for 1 week, and he'll need to retake the test under supervision." "Suspended?" Karen shrieked, her voice echoing off the walls. "Absolutely not. I demand that you revoke this suspension immediately. And as for the test, my son will be taking it at home, where he can focus without your biased supervision." The principal pinched the bridge of his nose, already feeling the onset of a migraine. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Mrs. Anderson. The school's policy is clear on matters of academic dishonesty." Karen leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a malicious grin. "Well, then I guess we're at an impasse, Mr. Hawkins, because I'm not leaving this office until you've reconsidered your decision." Principal Hawkins stared at Karen, his jaw clenched in frustration. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered a parent like her, someone who refused to accept responsibility for their child's misdeeds and instead lashed out at the authority figures trying to uphold the rules. "Mrs. Anderson," he said evenly, "I understand that you're upset, but I can assure you that the suspension will stand. Your son's cheating is a serious offense, and we have a zero-tolerance policy for academic dishonesty." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her manicured nails tapping against the desk. "Well, then I guess we're at an impasse, Mr. Hawkins, because I'm not leaving this office until you've reconsidered your decision." The principal sighed, already feeling the beginnings of a migraine. He knew from experience that arguing with someone like Karen was a futile endeavor. She would simply dig in her heels and refuse to back down. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm afraid I can't simply overturn the suspension based on your demands. If you have a legitimate appeal, I'd be happy to consider it, but—" "Legitimate appeal?" Karen interrupted, her voice dripping with disdain. "The only thing I need to appeal is your gross incompetence and bias against my son." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a sleek smartphone, her fingers tapping furiously on the screen. "Well, Since you refuse to listen to reason, I'll just have to take this matter to a higher authority. Principal Hawkins felt a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. What are you doing? He asked warily. I'm calling the school board, Karen replied, her lips curling into a triumphant smile. They'll be very interested to hear about how you're mistreating one of their star students. The principal opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, the sound of the office door bursting open cut him off. Mrs. Anderson, what is the meaning of this? A booming voice demanded. Turning, Principal Hawkins saw the stern face of the school board president, her brow furrowed with displeasure. Karen beamed, her eyes sparkling with vindication. Ah, Miss Sinclair, I'm so glad you could join us. I was just informing Principal Hawkins that his suspension of my son is completely unacceptable, and I'm hoping you can intervene on our behalf. Miss Sinclair fixed Karen with a withering stare. I'm well aware of the situation, Mrs. Anderson, and I can assure you that Principal Hawkins has acted entirely within the bounds of school policy. Karen's smile faltered, and she opened her mouth to argue, but the school board president raised a hand, silencing her. However, Miss Sinclair continued, I do believe that a parent-teacher conference would be the most appropriate next step, rather than this display. Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, and she glanced around the room, finally taking in the curious stares of the office staff. Fine, she muttered, her voice low and sullen. When can we have this conference? Principal Hawkins suppressed a triumphant grin. How does tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sound? Karen nodded, her jaw clenched. Very well. I'll be here. As she stormed out of the office, Principal Hawkins let out a weary sigh. He knew that this was far from over, but at least for now, he had managed to defuse the situation. Still, he couldn't help but wonder what other tricks Karen had up her sleeve. The next morning, Karen strode into the principal's office, her back straight and her eyes narrowed. Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair were already seated, waiting for her arrival. Good morning, Mrs. Anderson, Principal Hawkins said, his voice measured and professional. Thank you for coming. Karen offered a tight-lipped smile, taking a seat across from them. Let's just get this over with, shall we? Miss Sinclair cleared her throat, leaning forward in her chair. Mrs. Anderson, I understand you have concerns about the suspension of your son. However, I can assure you that Principal Hawkins has handled this situation in accordance with our school's policies. Karen scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. Policies? That's your defense. My son is an exemplary student, and you're willing to ruin his academic record over a single incident. Principal Hawkins held up a hand, silencing her. Mrs. Anderson, the evidence of your son's cheating is irrefutable. Witnesses saw him copying answers from another student's test, and we have the test papers to prove it. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her manicured nails tapping against the desk. Well, then your witnesses must be mistaken. My son would never do something like that. Miss Sinclair sighed, her expression one of exasperation. Mrs. Anderson, we understand that this is a difficult situation for you and your family, but... Difficult? Karen interrupted, her voice rising in pitch. This is an outrage. My son is being punished for something he didn't do, and you two are just sitting here, pretending to care about his well-being. Principal Hawkins felt a vein throbbing in his temple. Mrs. Anderson, I can assure you that we take this matter very seriously. However, the school's policies are in place to ensure academic integrity and fairness for all students. Karen let out a harsh laugh, her eyes glinting with malice. Fairness? That's rich, coming from a man who just yelled at my son in front of the entire class. Miss Sinclair held up a hand, silencing Karen before she could continue. Mrs. Anderson, I understand that you're upset, but the suspension will stand. However, we're willing to work with you and your son to help him make up the work he's missed and get back on track. Karen's face twisted with rage and she slammed her fist on the desk, causing the principal and Ms. Sinclair to jump. That's not good enough. My son deserves to be treated with respect, not like some common criminal. Principal Hawkins cleared his throat, his voice stern. Mrs. Anderson, I must insist that you calm down and approach this situation rationally. Yelling and making demands will not solve anything. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed defiantly. Oh, I'm being perfectly rational. It's you two who are being unreasonable. Miss Sinclair sighed, her expression weary. Mrs. Anderson, I'm afraid we've reached an impasse. The suspension will stand, and we'd like to move forward with a plan to help your son catch up on his work. Karen's lips curled into a cruel smile, and she shook her head slowly. Oh no, Miss Sinclair, this isn't over. Not by a long shot. With that, she stood up and strode towards the door, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair exchanged a worried glance, both of them feeling a sense of unease. They knew that Karen was not the type of person to back down easily, and they couldn't help but wonder what she had up her sleeve. Over the next few days, Karen was a constant presence at the school, her unwavering determination to overturn her son's suspension driving her to new heights of entitlement and aggression. She showed up unannounced in Principal Hawkins' office, demanding meetings with the school board. She accosted teachers in the hallways, berating them for their biased treatment of her son. And she bombarded the school's social media accounts with scathing reviews and angry rants, painting her son as an innocent victim of a corrupt and incompetent administration. Principal Hawkins and Ms. Sinclair did their best to remain calm and professional, but the constant harassment was taking a toll. They tried to reason with Karen, explaining that the suspension was non-negotiable and that her son's only path forward was to accept the consequences and focus on making up the missed work. But Karen would have none of it. She refused to back down, convinced that her wealth, status, and sheer force of will would ultimately prevail. This isn't over, Mr. Hawkins, she would snarl, her eyes narrowed to slits. I won't rest until my son's reputation is restored and you're held accountable for your actions. The principal could only shake his head in exasperation, wishing he had the power to simply ban Karen from the school grounds. But he knew that such a move would only further inflame the situation and potentially draw the ire of the school board. So he and Ms. Sinclair continued to play a delicate game of diplomacy, trying to appease Karen while also upholding the school's policies and maintaining a sense of order. One day, as Principal Hawkins was preparing to leave for the evening, his secretary burst into his office, her face flushed with panic. "Mr. Hawkins, you need to come quick," she exclaimed. "Mrs. Anderson is causing a scene in the main office, and the police have been called." Cursing under his breath, the principal hurried to the front of the school, Miss Sinclair hot on his heels. There, in the middle of the lobby, stood Karen, her designer blouse untucked and her hair in disarray. She was yelling at the security guard, her finger jabbing accusingly in his face. "How dare you lay your hands on me?" she shrieked. "I'm a taxpayer, and I have every right to be here." The security guard, a burly man with a stern expression, stood his ground, his arms crossed over his chest. "Ma'am, you're causing a disturbance and refusing to leave the premises," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I've asked you multiple times to leave, and you've refused. I had no choice but to call the police." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, Principal Hawkins stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mrs. Anderson, please, let's take this somewhere private," he said, his voice low and measured. Karen whirled on him, her eyes blazing with fury. "Private? Ha! The entire school needs to hear what you've done to my son." Miss Sinclair stepped forward, her expression grave. "Mrs. Anderson, this is not the appropriate time or place for this discussion. I must insist that you leave the premises immediately, or we will have no choice but to have you removed by the authorities." Karen's lips curled into a menacing smile. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere, Miss Sinclair. In fact, I think it's time I gave you both a taste of your own medicine." With that, she pulled out her phone and began dialing, her fingers moving with a practiced ease. Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair exchanged a worried glance, both of them wondering what Karen had up her sleeve this time. As Karen held the phone to her ear, Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair watched with bated breath, wondering what her next move would be. Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and within minutes, a pair of police officers burst through the front doors of the school. "What seems to be the problem here?" one of the officers asked, his gaze shifting between Karen, the security guard, and the school administrators. Karen turned to the officers, her face flush with triumph. "Officers, I'm so glad you're here. This school's principal and board president have been harassing me and my son, and I demand that you arrest them immediately." The officers looked taken aback, glancing uncertainly at Principal Hawkins and Ms. Sinclair. "Ma'am, I'm afraid we can't just arrest someone without cause," the other officer said, his brow furrowed with concern. "Can you explain what exactly happened here?" Karen launched into a tirade, her voice rising to a shrill pitch as she recounted the story of her son's unjust suspension and the school's tyrannical refusal to overturn it. She painted herself as the victim of a corrupt and abusive system, and the principal and board president as heartless bureaucrats who were out to ruin her family. The officers listened silently, their expressions growing more and more skeptical as Karen's tale unfolded. Finally, one of them held up a hand, silencing her. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but based on the information you provided, it doesn't appear that any laws have been broken. This seems to be a matter of school policy and discipline, which is outside of our jurisdiction." Karen's face contorted with fury, and she turned to the officers, her eyes blazing. "What do you mean, it's outside your jurisdiction? These people are abusing their power, and I demand that you arrest them." The officer shook his head, his voice firm. "Ma'am, we can't just arrest someone because you disagree with their decisions. If you have a legitimate grievance, you'll need to pursue it through the proper legal channels." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the officer cut her off, his expression hardening. "Now I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to escort you off the property." Karen's face flushed with humiliation, and she glared at the officers, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "I'll make sure you all pay for this." With that, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the school, her designer heels clacking against the linoleum floor. Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair let out a collective sigh of relief, exchanging a weary glance. "Thank you, officers," Miss Sinclair said, her voice tinged with gratitude. "We appreciate you coming so quickly." The officers nodded, their expressions sympathetic. "No problem," one of them replied. "We get calls like this all the time from parents who don't like the school's decisions. Just try to keep a cool head, and don't let her get to you." With that, the officers took their leave, and Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair were left to pick up the pieces of the latest Karen-fueled disaster. In the days that followed, Karen's campaign against the school only intensified. She flooded the school board's inbox with scathing emails, demanding that Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair be fired. She organized a protest outside the school, rallying other parents to her cause and painting herself as a martyr for the rights of all students. Meanwhile, Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair found themselves subjected to a constant barrage of scrutiny and criticism. Parents who had previously praised the school's leadership suddenly turned on them, echoing Karen's accusations of bias and incompetence. The school's reputation began to suffer, and enrollment numbers started to decline as concerned parents pulled their children out of the system. The administration was in crisis, and the pressure was mounting with each passing day. One afternoon, as Principal Hawkins was poring over the latest budget projections, his secretary burst into the office, her face pale with worry. "Mr. Hawkins, "You need to come to the front office immediately," she said, her voice trembling. "There's been an incident with Mrs. Anderson." Feeling a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach, the principal hurried to the main lobby, Miss Sinclair right behind him. There, in the middle of the room, stood Karen, her face twisted into a triumphant grin. Beside her, a security guard lay on the floor, his hands cuffed behind his back. "What is the meaning of this?" Principal Hawkins demanded, his eyes widening with shock. Karen's smile only widened, and she gestured towards the hapless security guard. "This man had the audacity to lay his hands on me, so I decided to return the favor and have him arrested for assault." Ms. Sinclair stepped forward, her expression one of disbelief. "Mrs. Anderson, this is completely unacceptable. The security guard was simply doing his job and trying to remove you from the premises after you refused to leave." Karen let out a harsh laugh, her eyes glinting with malice. "Oh, I'm sure the judge will see it that way. But in the meantime, I think it's only fair that you and Mr. Hawkins join him in handcuffs." Before the principal and board president could react, a pair of police officers strode into the lobby, their faces grim. "Mrs. Anderson has filed a formal complaint against the school," one of the officers announced, his voice stern. "We'd have no choice but to detain the principal and board president for questioning." Principal Hawkins felt his heart sink as the officers approached him and Ms. Sinclair, their hands reaching for their handcuffs. "This can't be happening," he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. As the cuffs clicked around his wrists, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread and resignation. He knew that Karen was a force to be reckoned with, and he had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of her vendetta against him and the school. Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair sat in the back of the police cruiser, their hands cuffed behind their backs. The ride to the police station was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the radio. As they were led into the station, Karen trailed behind them, a smug expression on her face. "Don't worry, Mr. Hawkins, Miss Sinclair," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure this will all be cleared up in no time." The principal and board president were ushered into separate interrogation rooms, where they were met by a stern-faced detective. "All right, let's start with you, Mr. Hawkins," the detective said, his eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Anderson has filed a complaint against you and Ms. Sinclair, alleging abuse of power and assault. What do you have to say for yourself?" Principal Hawkins felt his stomach twist with dread. He knew that the situation had spiraled far beyond his control, and that Karen's thirst for revenge knew no bounds. "Detective, this is all a misunderstanding," he began, his voice steady despite the panic he felt inside. "Mrs. Anderson is upset because we had to suspend her son for cheating on a test. But we followed the school's policies to the letter, and the security guard was only trying to remove her from the premises when she refused to leave." The detective nodded, his expression unreadable. "And what about the alleged assault?" "Mrs. Anderson claims the security guard used excessive force against her." "That's simply not true," Principal Hawkins insisted. "The security guard acted with restraint, and only after Mrs. Anderson became belligerent and refused to cooperate." The detective studied him for a moment, then let out a heavy sigh. "Look, Mr. Hawkins, I understand that this is a complicated situation. But the fact is, Mrs. Anderson has filed a formal complaint, and we have to take it seriously." Principal Hawkins felt a surge of frustration. "Detective, surely you can see that this is nothing more than a vindictive attempt by Mrs. Anderson to get back at us for disciplining her son. Surely you don't actually believe her fabrications." The detective held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not here to judge the merits of the case, Mr. Hawkins. My job is to investigate the complaint and gather the facts. And right now, the facts are that Mrs. Anderson has accused you and Miss Sinclair of wrongdoing." He paused, his expression grim. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to hold you and Miss Sinclair for further questioning. You'll be booked and processed like any other suspect." Principal Hawkins felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. He knew that this was going to be a long and drawn-out battle, and that Karen was not going to back down easily. As he was led away to the holding cell, he couldn't help but wonder what other tricks Karen had up her sleeve. One thing was certain. This was far from over. Hours later, Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair sat in the cramped holding cell, their wrists sore from the tight handcuffs. The air was thick with tension, and the only sound was the occasional clang of the cell door as a guard walked past. "I can't believe this is happening," Miss Sinclair murmured, her face etched with worry. "How could we have let it come to this?" Principal Hawkins let out a weary sigh. "It's all because of that woman, Karen. She's relentless, and she won't stop until she's destroyed us." Miss Sinclair shook her head, her brow furrowed with concern. "But why is she so hell-bent on this? Surely there must be more to it than just her son's suspension." The principal leaned back against the cold, steel wall, his mind racing. "I don't know, but whatever it is, she's not going to stop until she's gotten her revenge. She's managed to turn the entire community against us." As the words left his mouth, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention to the cell door. There, standing on the other side, was Karen, her lips curled into a triumphant smile. "Well, well, well," she purred, her eyes glinting with malice. "Look at you two, sitting in your little jail cell. Doesn't it just make you feel so insignificant?" Principal Hawkins gripped the bars of the cell, his knuckles turning white. "What do you want, Karen?" he spat. Karen let out a melodramatic sigh. "What do I want? Why, I want justice, of course. For my poor, innocent son, who's been so cruelly wronged by your biased and incompetent administration." Miss Sinclair leaned forward, her expression pleading. "Mrs. Anderson, please, this has gone too far. Can't we just sit down and talk this through like rational adults?" Karen's smile only widened. "Oh, I'm afraid that ship has sailed, my dear. You see, I've already made sure that the school board has received a detailed report of your misdeeds. And let's just say, they weren't too pleased." Principal Hawkins felt a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your impending dismissal, Mr. Hawkins," Karen replied, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "And as for you, Miss Sinclair, well, let's just say your days on the school board are numbered." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the two of them with undisguised contempt. "You see, I'm not just going to stop with you two. I'm going to make sure that every single person who's ever wronged my son pays the price." With that, she turned on her heel and strode away, leaving Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair in stunned silence. As the weight of Karen's words sank in, the two administrators felt a sense of dread wash over them. They knew that they were facing an uphill battle, one that could very well cost them their careers and reputations. But they also knew that they couldn't back down. Not now, not ever. They had to stand firm and fight back, no matter the cost. With a renewed sense of determination, Principal Hawkins and Miss Sinclair exchanged a resolute glance. They may be down, but they were certainly not out. And they were going to make sure that Karen's reign of terror came to an end, once and for all.